Let's talk about all the books I read in March while I update my reading journal. March was a very good reading month, a surprising reading month also, because I read mostly books that I wouldn't have picked up if it wasn't for my Leve TBR. So I'm really excited to talk about these books, so let's get into it. Though brilliantly sunny, Saturday morning was overcoat weather again, not just topcoat weather, as it had been all week, and as everyone had hoped it would stay for the big weekend, the weekend of the Yale game. This opening line from Franny Zooey by J.D. Salinger kind of sums up the style of this book perfectly. Witty and eye-roll-inducingly pretentious, but in the best way. This book follows Franny and Zoe Glass, the two youngest children of the Glass family. Throughout the different parts of the book, I grew to like different things about it. The first part follows Franny, and the way Salinger describes her fighting this existential crisis that is falling upon her was really brilliant to me. For Zoe's part, I won't talk about the plot really, but instead I want to touch on two things that were most memorable to me and left the biggest impression in terms of writing and themes as well. The first thing was the letter from Buddy, an older brother in the Glass family, to Zoe. This is possibly the most outrageously pretentious part of this book. It is very long in proportion to the overall length of this book as well, and it has passages like, I was talking to a rather pompous Orientalist over the weekend, and at one point, during a very deep metaphysical lull in the conversation, I told him I had a little brother who once got over an unhappy love affair by trying to translate Mundaka Upanishad into classical Greek. He laughed uproariously, you know the way Orientalists laugh. Or, the cards are stacked quite properly, I imagine, against all professional aesthetes, and no doubt we all deserve the dark, wordy, academic deaths we sooner or later die. And these aren't quite the worst ones, but I laughed out loud at many of these, and I think especially when Buddy calls his little brother a dirty little bookworm, and that is now my favorite new insult, and I'll leave you wondering about the context of this phrase. In the final part of the book, I noticed all the sentences I underlined were very similar, and although I don't think it necessarily reflects the overall message of the book, it's definitely a thing that I took away from it, and I'll talk more about this theme as well when I review devotions later on in this video. But there's a lot of talk about aesthetics and the beauty of the world, and it took me a bit by surprise when Zoe says, "That's my Achilles heel, and don't you forget it. To me, everything is beautiful. Show me a pink sunset and I'm limp, by God. Anything. Peter Pan. Even before the curtain goes up at Peter Pan, I'm a goddamn puddle of tears." And my camera roll being full of pink sunsets, I suddenly weirdly related to this main character. And again, when he said, "There are nice things in this world, and I mean nice things. We're all such morons to get so sidetracked." As I said, this is not really the overall message of the book. I think it's a lot more about identity and finding yourself and finding integrity. There is a bit of a religious theme, but in the grander scheme of finding your purpose in life, I'd say. So apparently, the Glass family members are recurring characters in Salinger's work, and it kind of snuck up on me. I definitely didn't realize while I was reading, but I definitely want to read more now, because these characters were definitely very intriguing, especially the ones we've only got glimpses of. I definitely enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought I would. I didn't really have any expectations. I never would have picked it up if it hadn't been for my Leve-inspired TBR, which is why I love making these TBR videos, because it introduces me to books I would have never picked up, and turn out I really enjoyed them. I ended up rating this book 4 stars. During my reading experience, it felt more like a 3.5, but sometimes when I reread some passages to write these reviews, the rating and feeling increases or decreases a bit. And looking back, this book was definitely 4 stars overall. I would recommend it, especially if you do like Salinger's writing style and these themes of social mockery and identity. Next, I read Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Our main character is immediately introduced in the first line. My name is Kathy H. I'm 31 years old and I've been a carer now for over 11 years. Kathy tells her story starting at Hailsham, a boarding school in England. It's clear from the start that they are isolated from the outside world, but why and how we sort of discover throughout the book. And I won't say anything about the plot because I went in knowing nothing, and I think that's the best way to read this book. So I'll try to describe what this book felt like reading without touching on the story. It's kind of dark academia meets science fiction, but I wouldn't classify this book as either. It's a dystopia with science fiction elements, but they don't play a huge part in the story, but more so in the overall moral of the story. And then it definitely has some dark academia elements and vibes to it, but it doesn't fit the classic trope that you would see in, for example, The Secret History or If You Were Villains either. I think both the dark academia and science fiction elements serve the overall message or critique on the world and how we treat people that are different, and then also the more introspective existential themes of what is the purpose of life and what is my role. This definitely sounds a lot more convoluted than the story reads. I just think you should go in knowing nothing about the story or the characters. One thing that stood out to me is how consistent reading Never Let Me Go felt. There were no boring bits, even though I would say it was rather slow-paced. It consistently kept my attention. The writing is very simple. I didn't annotate a lot until near the end when I think I was getting attached to some of these characters that the lines just read kind of differently. I would definitely take my time reading this. I enjoyed processing this story in small sips. This was my first Kazuo Ishiguro, and if you have read more of his work, I'm really curious to hear which one you would recommend next. I did really enjoy Never Let Me Go. I rated it 4 stars in the end. Not a new favourite, but one I will think about from time to time, for sure. And also just the consistency was really impressive for me, because it doesn't happen to me that often. So I definitely want to read more of his work. I do have a copy of The Buried Giant that I picked up in a charity shop, so I might read that one next. But if you feel strongly about any of the author's other books, please let me know. I think I've saved every single Mary Oliver poem that I've come across on social media, because every time I think, wow, I love the way this person looks at the world. And so when I saw this collection in the store in Berlin, I picked it up, even though it was a bit of a stretch for March's TBR, but I felt like I could make it fit. And I'm so glad I did. I thoroughly enjoyed this collection of selected poems. I'm still not completely finished, but I don't want to rush, and I think I've read enough to include it in my wrap-up, and I just really want to share some poems with you. I will undoubtedly still post her poems incessantly on Instagram, because I read some of them back already, even though I'm not even finished. I already am going back to some. I think what I enjoy is that it is very much in line with my recent aim to notice the beauty of the mundane more, as I was mentioning in my review of Franny Zooey. It's just made my life so much more wonderful, and partly because of it, but also in this case just by chance, I've been consuming a lot of media and art that also does this. I've been rewatching some Studio Ghibli, some shows that really do this well, and many of Mary Oliver's poems do this too. She talks about nature, about animals, about bees in such an intricate way and with so much wonder that it really just romanticizes so many daily things. One of the first poems I bookmarked was What Gorgeous Thing, fittingly. It goes, I do not know what gorgeous thing the bluebird keeps saying, his voice easing out of his throat, beak, body into the pink air of the early morning. I like it, whatever it is. Sometimes it seems the only thing in the world that is without dark thoughts. Sometimes it seems the only thing in the world that is without questions that can't and probably never will be answered. The only thing that is entirely content with the pink, then clear white morning and gratefully says so. There are many similar poems, and I won't recite them all here, but I really enjoy these type of poems. I wouldn't say that I love every single collection of every single poem, which I think is normal. I noticed that I bookmarked the most in the Swan collection so far. I do have a few more collections to go, so maybe there will be others that I really like also. If that's the case, I'll make sure to let you know. I think it's a very accessible poetry collection. I don't read a ton of poetry and it can often feel daunting for me to do so, but I had no issues here, so you will definitely hear me talk a lot more about Mary Oliver. If you have any poetry recommendations, also let me know. This is definitely motivating me to read more poetry again, and I only have one unread poetry collection on my shelf, which is Bluets by Maggie Nelson. Well, I'll definitely be reading that one, and then I have no other ones planned, so let me know if you have any suggestions. I want to end with a small part of Mary Oliver's poem Sometimes, which reads, "Instructions for life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it." Finally, I also read Circe by Madeline Miller, my least anticipated read on this list by far. When I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. Circe is born an outcast, not as powerful as her father Helios, not as beautiful and charming as her mother, and she gets made fun of in the halls of the gods, not being a full god herself, not being immortal either, but she finds her power and gets banished to an island where she grows to be what she is known for, the most powerful sorceress in Greek mythology. I'm definitely late in reading Circe. I read the Song of Achilles years ago and I liked it well enough, but I wasn't gushing over it the way my bookish friends or booktube were doing, and so I thought that maybe Madeline Miller was just not my author. I'm not a huge fan of Greek retellings to begin with, although I can't say I've read much, but so I didn't really have Circe on my radar. But when I was looking for a final book for March, which I wanted to get on my Kindle to have something on the go, and Circe was Leve's book club pick, which seemed kind of perfect since I didn't know if I was going to like it, and so I wouldn't buy a physical copy. So I had very low expectations of Circe, but I actually really loved it. It's got the same wonderful writing as the Song of Achilles, but the story is told very differently and the themes are very different. I loved the way that it included reflections on motherhood, on becoming yourself and trying to fit in, on the wrath of gods and men. And I feel like this book covered so much, but it made it somehow very digestible. I also don't want to underplay the romance aspect of this book, because while, as with gods who live eternally, lovers come and go, some of my favorite passages are from the romance part of this book, both in terms of how Circe would talk about the relationships, such as, "He showed me his scars, and in return he let me pretend that I had none," or, "But in a solitary life there are rare moments when another soul dips near yours, as stars once a year brush the earth. Such a constellation was he to me," which are such wonderful ways to describe how you feel about someone and the connection you have. I also loved the way characters were described, lover or other alike. For example, the anger stood out plain and clean on his face. There was a sort of innocence to him, I thought. I do not mean this as the poets mean it, a virtue to be broken by the story's end or else upheld at the greatest cost. Nor do I mean that he was foolish or guileless. I mean that he was made only of himself, without the dregs that clog the rest of us. He thought and felt and acted, and all these things made a straight line. No wonder his father had been so baffled by him. He would have been always looking for the hidden meaning, the knife in the dark, but his son carried his blade in the open. There are so many passages, expressions, words even, that I underlined in this book. Madeline Miller is such a brilliant writer, and for me this stood out a lot more in Circe than it did in Song of Achilles. it even made me consider reading more Greek retellings, which is strange for me because I've never had a tendency to do so. Maybe it's because I associate them with my Latin classes in high school, which I did not enjoy and quit eventually, but maybe I should reconsider. Looking back, a lot of these had very introspective, existential almost themes, which was an unintended commonality, but I really enjoyed my March reads. So these were all the books I read. It was a bit of a slower reading month, but a very good one. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give it a like if you did. As always, thank you so much for watching and have a nice day.